Welcome to this explainer on the G7. Today, we're going to dive right into the hidden mechanics of one of the world's most influential, yet completely informal, diplomatic clubs. If you've ever found yourself wondering how a tiny group of leaders can just sit around a table and somehow shift the gears of the entire global economy, well, you are absolutely in the right place. So, how exactly does a club with no rules actually rule the world? It's kind of the ultimate paradox, right? For nearly half a century, the Group of Seven, that's the US, Japan, Germany, the UK, France, Italy, and Canada, has been practically directing financial markets, coordinating major international sanctions, and setting the agenda for global trade. And yet, as an actual institution, it defies pretty much every convention of international politics. We're going to explore exactly how they managed to pull this off.
Because here's what's truly fascinating. It's all about what the G7 doesn't have. It is not a formal international organization like the United Nations or NATO. There's no founding treaty, they don't have a permanent headquarters, no standing bureaucracy, no independent budget, and absolutely zero military or enforcement mechanism. They literally cannot pass a single law or levy a single tax. And yet, the geopolitical power they project is just massive. So how on earth does a club with zero legal authority actually function?
Section 1. Behind closed doors, the iceberg of diplomacy.
To really get how they function, we've got to look way past that famous family photo of world leaders smiling and waving at the annual summit. That photo? That's just the tip of the iceberg. The true machinery runs year-round, driven by this relentless annual cycle. The real engine of the G7 is its rotating presidency, which shifts to a new member every single January 1st. And this is a huge deal because the host country gets this massive power to set the global agenda for the year. For instance, when Japan hosts, you might see a really heavy emphasis on Indo-Pacific security. If Italy hosts, they might pivot to prioritize migration, while Germany might focus heavily on industrial competitiveness. So throughout the spring and summer, there's just this intense flurry of ministerial meetings and technical working groups tackling everything from AI to supply chains, all building up to the main summit. But honestly, the real heavy lifting, that's done by individuals known as Sherpas. Yeah, they actually borrowed the term from those incredible Himalayan guides who help climbers reach the summit. A G7 Sherpa is a senior diplomatic rep appointed directly by a world leader. They literally spend months negotiating agreements, resolving bitter disputes, and drafting complex policy. By the time the prime ministers and presidents actually arrive at the summit, the Sherpas have already cleared the path and drastically narrowed down any disagreements. Now, here is a real game changer when it comes to how they make decisions. 100% consensus is required. The G7 doesn't do majority voting. Every single member essentially has a veto, meaning no one country can just be overruled. Because of this, diplomats will literally argue for hours over a single comma. They'll fiercely debate whether to say they condemn an action, express concern, or just urge restraint. It sounds super tedious, I know, but every single phrase carries distinct legal and diplomatic weight. It makes reaching an agreement incredibly painful. But on the flip side, when all 7 governments publicly endorse the exact same language, it is incredibly credible to global markets and international rivals alike.
And this brilliantly illustrates how the whole thing actually lands. At the end of the summit, they released this joint declaration called a communiqué. But remember, the G7 has absolutely no legal authority, so this communiqué isn't legally binding in any way. There's no international police force that's going to show up to enforce it. The real power relies entirely on what happens next. These leaders have to return home and utilize their own domestic institutions, their own national legislatures and executive agencies, to pass the laws and enact the policies they just promised each other they'd support. It's really an exercise in pure, high-stakes political commitment.
Section 2. An era of dominance. Why the G7 ruled. So you might be wondering, why did the rest of the world actually listen to these informal political commitments for so long? Well, the answer boils down to one staggering number: 60%. Back in the late 20th century, the G7 accounted for well over 60% of all global GDP. We're talking about a jaw-dropping concentration of economic power in just 7 capitals. This era of dominance was built on just unbreakable financial gravity. These 7 nations anchored the global reserve currencies: the US dollar, the Japanese yen, the German mark. They hosted the world's largest consumer markets, headquartered the top multinational corporations, and they drove the vast majority of international trade. Because they literally held the purse strings of the planet, when the G7 decided to coordinate on things like debt relief or global tax rules or international sanctions, massive institutions like the IMF and the WTO, they simply had to follow their lead. For a very long time, they were the undeniable center of the global economy. Section 3.
a fading global empire, the turning tide. But hey, here is the major twist of this explainer. The world that built the G7 back in the 1970s, it just doesn't exist anymore. Simple arithmetic is working against them now. When we measure the global economy by purchasing power parity, which is a metric that adjusts for differences in domestic prices, the G7 today accounts for less than 1/3 of global output. Yeah, 70% of the world's economic activity by this metric is now happening completely outside of the G7. They just no longer possess that overwhelming economic weight you need to unilaterally dictate global rules.
You really saw this shift in power crystallize right after the 2008 global financial crisis. It suddenly became mathematically impossible to orchestrate a global economic recovery without having countries like China, India, and Brazil at the table. So the G20 Leaders Summit was elevated to step in. Unlike the super-exclusive G7, which is strictly restricted to advanced democracies, the G20 brings in both advanced and emerging economies. Together, they represent a massive 85% of global GDP and 75% of world trade. Today, many of the huge economic issues that the G7 used to just handle all on its own now require the much broader consensus of the G20.
And at the exact same time, we're seeing the rapid expansion of BRICS. Originally just an acronym for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, it's really evolved into a major geopolitical alternative for middle powers. These nations are actively seeking out reforms to Western-controlled payment systems, they're pushing hard for greater representation for developing countries, and they're heavily advocating for the use of local currencies in global trade. It is a loud and clear signal that significant global powers are looking for forms outside of the traditional Western-led architecture.
To make matters even trickier, alongside those external pressures, internal fractures are really starting to grow within the G7 itself. Getting to that 100% consensus, it's getting way harder. On trade, we're seeing real tensions over industrial policy, new tariffs, and supply chain subsidies. When it comes to China, the US is increasingly emphasizing strategic competition, while European members and Japan have to carefully balance those security concerns with their own heavy reliance on China as a vital export market. And on energy and climate, look, while everyone generally agrees on the end goal, members frequently clash over the actual pace of decarbonization, whether to use nuclear power, and how to handle carbon border measures. These totally different domestic priorities are making that required unanimous agreement increasingly elusive. And honestly, these aren't just high-level diplomatic debates. These disagreements directly dictate the prices of the goods we buy and the energy we consume every single day. Section 4. The new Democratic Coordinator. Evolution, not obsolescence.
So wait, is the G7 just dead?
No, absolutely not. What we are witnessing is an evolution. There's a quote from our source material that I think perfectly captures this pivot. Its future relevance lies less in directing globalization than in coordinating the policies of advanced democracies. The G7 is no longer the sole architect of the global economy. Instead, it has morphed into a highly effective, rapid-response geopolitical coordinator. Because here's the thing, this is what they still do better than anyone else on the planet. Since these 7 nations share compatible democratic institutions and really deep, long-standing alliances, they can reach a consensus much faster than massive, diverse organizations like the UN or the G20 ever could. When a crisis hits, the G7 can coordinate rapid international sanctions basically overnight, as we've seen recently. They can instantly align export controls on sensitive, advanced technologies. They can quickly pool massive resources to finance reconstruction and critical humanitarian aid. And maybe most importantly right now, they are uniquely positioned to set baseline regulatory standards for wild new frontiers like AI and cybersecurity. That means the G7 is effectively writing the safety rules for the apps and the tech you use every single day. Which leaves us with this final, pretty massive question to chew on. As economic power continues to scatter and disperse all across the globe, is forging political alignment among a small group of wealthy democracies actually going to be enough to sustain the G7's legacy in a multipolar century? They might not dictate the rules of the world anymore, but as the fastest and most united bloc of democratic power out there, their next chapter just might be their most critical one yet. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and remember, always keep questioning the hidden mechanics of our world. See you next time.